can you believe it? Here we are again, another Friday, another tag, and we're on to week 12. This is our week where we play with a stitch, and sort of leading on from last week when we were doing the blanket stitch around the circles, I just thought we'd have a bit of a play with blanket stitch because it can be a really, really versatile stitch. So I've got a couple of samples here that I did with a project. Firstly with another group and then also with our Embroiderers Guild that is just exploring blanket stitch. So it was drawing a square onto the piece of fabric. So I've got one bit of fabric here that's a piece of calico, and then there's a little bit of blanket just stitched onto the back just to make it that little bit firmer to stitch with. And then this is a piece of vintage quilt, but it's basically using the blanket stitch, but it's playing around with it and playing around with the width, the length, altering it, etc. So this one was just using one thread, but it's a variegated thread, which can be really, really nice to use. So a variegated thread is one where you've just got one skein of embroidery cotton and it changes colour as you're stitching. So you might decide that you want to use something like that with this particular challenge. And it is just really, really nice how the colours just change as you are stitching. But this is all blanket stitch, so working in circles, straight lines, little shapes in the corners and overlapping the stitches as you go. Obviously this is bigger than the tag that I've been doing, but it's just to show you really how effective it can be just playing around with one particular stitch. The other sample then, I did use different colours with this. So I think I've got about 3 or 4 different shades of blue. This is a perlé cotton and different thicknesses, different weights of cotton. But again, playing with that blanket stitch. So this time we've got meandering lines. We've got blanket stitches, individual, just isolated stitches. So rather than connecting them like you would do normally, just having them as individual stitches can be really, really nice to work with, and also play with scale. So that's what we're going to have a little bit of a play around with. So you're going to need a backing piece of fabric. I've got a little bit of a quilt that I want to use. I'm a bit obsessed with using quilts at the moment, so I've trimmed that just to the size of my tag, and I've chosen 2 different weights of thread. So I'm not going perlé threads this time. I've got like a linen, a really nice green linen, and then a dyed cotton single threads. So I've got 2 different weights because I just thought that would be quite nice to play around with. So we've got our needles already threaded. So I'm going to start off just really simply, just with a straight line, just looking at my piece of fabric and just following one of the lines down the fabric. So a blanket stitch. Basically, you're going to come up. I shall try and zoom in a little bit. Whoops. There we go. Okay. So you're going to come up through your fabric. Just lay your thread along. And then depending on how big you want the legs to be, you basically go into your fabric, come back up, and then make sure that that thread goes behind your needle, and then just slowly pull it through, and you create a little corner. Okay, it's a tiny, tiny little corner. Okay, to do connecting ones, continue to lay your thread along, and then you just do another little stitch. Okay, make sure the thread goes behind the needle, just pull it through slowly, and then you've made a connection of 2. Okay, so what you're going to do then is just have a bit of a play. So I might decide that I want to come down. Now if you want to follow a line, one of the things that you can do is either pencil or using a fabric marker. This one is a washable one, so if I put water on it afterwards it'll disappear. I could just draw myself a little line that I want to follow, and all I do then is just lay my thread along the line, and then when I do my stitch the needle comes up actually on the line. And this is when you can start playing, because as I'm coming across, I might decide to make the little legs of my stitch a little bit longer, and I might decide to start putting them a little bit closer together. So you can sort of see I'm beginning to take this across my quilt. Now, because you're playing just on one little bit of fabric, you do need to be careful about the tension and how tight you are pulling those threads, because if you pull them really tight, you're going to start distorting your bit of fabric. So just be careful about how much tension you put on that. So as I'm coming across now, I might start making my legs a little bit shorter, and then extending the width of my stitch. So the legs are going shorter. There we go. And then once you get into the swing of it, this is this thing about stitching and slow stitching, is actually once you get into a rhythm with what you're doing, it's very therapeutic. Right, when you get to the end, then all you need to do is finish your last stitch. Got my last stitch there, and all you do is the hole that you came up, just go back down, then it just finishes that last stitch off. If you finish stitching that particular colour, just do a couple of stitches at the back, go through the loop. There we go, and trim it off. Okay, so that's our first little line of blanket stitch. So the idea about using two different thicknesses or two different weights, or even like I am, I've got like a cotton and linen, is that you can really start playing around now with your overlapping of the stitches, and this is where this is going to start working. So I might decide that I want to have the straight edge in contrast and actually have some of the legs going through the middle of these. So again, I could draw a line, but I'm going to just go with it. So what I'm going to do now is where I've got my gap there, I'm actually going to put the leg down the middle and just decide where you want that to come up. There we go. So I'm going to start overlapping it could be that I go parallel, I might decide not to. And I think the thing with this sort of stitching as well is that idea about not planning too much, of just seeing what your stitching does and just actually seeing where it takes you. Just take a little bit of a risk. So you can see I'm beginning to build up in between the layers, in between the little legs. So all I'm doing is where I've got the legs there, I'm coming down the middle. You'll notice I'm not going in and out with this because it's a slightly thicker thread. It's just taking that little bit more effort just to pull it through, and if I tried to do it in one go, it would definitely distort everything that I'm doing. Now I could then, not sure that I want to follow that all the way, So I might just do one more of that one. Do I just do one more, or do I go all the way? Keep going. Oh, but I might come off the edge. So start making this now just that little bit smaller. So still fitting it between the lines of my previous stitch. But I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. Oh yeah, that's okay. And then I'll get my other colour, my blue again. I'll probably just choose 2 colours for this. You could go bonkers if you wanted to and throw loads maybe of the same shade of colour, which would be really nice, a little bit like I did with my blue one. I went from like a very pale blue to a very dark blue, which was nice. But this little bit of vintage quilt has a tiny bit of blue in it and a tiny bit of green, so I just went with the colours that I could see on my bit of fabric. So you could end up with, you could do a really teeny tinies. So I think because I've done this curve, I think I'll probably do some straights next. Just fit one more in. Go. So again, just to finish it off, when you've got to that last stitch, you could just give it, if you wanted to give it a little bit of a tail, you can do, but I tend to go just back down so it finishes it off on a corner. So that's going to be the stitch for this week, which is your blanket stitch. And I'd really love to see you just playing. I've been amazed with the previous ones that we've done, how people have really played with that stitch and come up with some absolutely fantastic ideas and some beautiful patterns, such like really intricate little bits and pieces. So I look forward to seeing what you do. That's week 12, and I'll be back next week with week 13. See you soon.